Hello everyone, welcome back for more human physiology. So next we are going to continue our look into the brain, and we are going to start talking about the brainstem and the cerebellum. So let's go ahead and get into it. So the brainstem consists of two structures called the midbrain and the hindbrain. The midbrain, which you can see highlighted here in this kind of blue color, is going to consist of structures that are going to be involved in some of the finer parts of processing both visual and auditory information and integrating it into the appropriate motor responses. And then the hindbrain is going to consist of two exquisitely important structures called the pons and the medulla, which are very important in our ability to regulate things on an autonomic basis. So things like our heart rate, things like our breathing rate, and things of that nature. And we will become more familiar with them as the semester goes along. So let's start with the midbrain. Some of the major structures that you find within the midbrain are called colliculi. One of them, called the superior colliculus, is involved in visual processing. Now, we've already seen a diagram that looks something like this, in which we have visual information coming through the optic nerve, hitting the optic chiasm, and maybe or maybe not crossing over to the contralateral side. And what you can see here is a little bit of extra information that we couldn't really see before. We can see that this afferent visual information is eventually bound for the visual cortex in the occipital lobe back here. You can see the thalamus here that is going to direct that information to the visual cortex. But before it gets there, it hits a couple of structures, and the superior colliculus is one of these. Unfortunately, in this diagram, you don't exactly see it labeled, but what the superior colliculus is going to do is receive that visual information, and then based on what kind of visual information is there, it will direct that information to the motor cortex that we talked about before in the frontal lobe. Basically, the idea here is that this allows us to fine-tune our body movements in response to what we see. So if you are, say, walking along and you see a bird flying at you from the right, what you see with your eyes, you see the bird flying at you, you can then very quickly turn that into a body movement so that you can either back up and get out of the way or something else. On the other hand, the inferior colliculus, which you can see in this rightmost diagram, is going to do the same sort of thing, except it's going to deal with auditory information. And it's going to take information from the vestibulocochlear nerve, and then, very similar to what the superior colliculus did, it will then transmit that information to the frontal lobe so that we can move the body in response to what you hear. Again, imagine that you're, say, walking down the railroad tracks. If you suddenly hear a train whistle, you're probably going to want to immediately get off of the tracks, and the inferior colliculus allows you to do that based on the things that you hear. Okay, so let's talk about the pons and the medulla. The pons is kind of like a big bridge of white matter that connects the cerebellum, which we will talk about next, to the rest of the brainstem. It's going to contain several different nuclei, and when you see the term nucleus, you should automatically think either relay center or control center of some kind. So these nuclei within the pons are going to help us regulate things that, like I said, are regulated on an autonomic basis. Things like our breathing rate and our ability to respire, which we will talk about very much so when we get to chapter 22 on the respiratory system. The medulla oblongata is continuous with the pons. It's just a little bit further down, and it's also continuous with the spinal cord. And it contains many nuclei that are involved in motor control, breathing like what we saw with the pons, regulating heart rate, and vasomotor control for our smooth muscle functions. So what we could do right now is we could talk about all of these different functions in very nice detail, but I think what the smarter thing for us to do is to just be aware of these things for right now and then revisit them once we get to those appropriate organ systems. So for example, we've already seen here that the pons and the medulla contain nuclei that are involved in regulating our breathing rate. Well, would it not make more sense for us to wait until we've actually talked about the respiratory system before we get into that? The medulla contains nuclei involved in regulating your heart rate and your blood pressure. So we probably will want to wait until we've talked about the cardiovascular system before we go there. One thing that we can go ahead and talk about is that we've already mentioned that afferent and efferent information have this tendency to decussate or cross over to the contralateral side of the brain or of the body at different points. And we can go ahead and mention now that very often, if this crossing over occurs, it happens at the level of the medulla. So let's take a look at that. And the nice thing about this particular diagram is not only does this allow us to see what's happening at the medulla, but it allows us to reaffirm a lot of what we've talked about before in terms of afferent and efferent information coming into and out of the central nervous system. So let's start on the left side. So the left side of the diagram is going to cover the afferent side, and the right side is going to cover the efferent side. So the particular pathway that we're taking here, the particular stimulus as it is illustrated, is that someone's tickling the bottom of your foot. So we won't get into what kind of situation you would find yourself in if someone's tickling the bottom of your foot. Probably 80% of those situations would involve you calling the cops, but that's not for me to say. So let's say some weirdo is tickling the bottom of your foot. So what you are stimulating here are touch receptors in the skin of your foot. So those touch receptors are located on sensory neurons, as we have seen before. The axon of that sensory neuron is going to project into the spinal cord. Notice how it comes into kind of the back or posterior side of the spinal cord. Take note of that because that's going to become important later on in this chapter. So this afferent information, the axon of this sensory neuron comes into the spinal cord, and then we are going to take what's called an ascending tract up through the spinal cord and up towards the brain. Based on the way this is drawn, we are on what appears to be the left side of the body. So we can assume that someone is tickling the bottom of your left foot. So as we go into the spinal cord and up the spinal cord, this information stays on the left side. But look what happens when we get to the level of the medulla oblongata. We cross over to the contralateral side, meaning we cross from the left side over to the right side. And now this afferent information gets processed in the right side of the thalamus here. Again, the thalamus is a very common relay center for sensory or afferent information. And then this gets directed over to the somatosensory cortex of the right hemisphere of the parietal lobe. Now, one thing you should take note of here is that each one of these that you see here that starts with a cell body, which is indicated by this little dot here, and then an axon, each one of these is an individual neuron. So this sensory neuron will fire an action potential going up through the spinal cord, and then here's its axon terminal right here, so it will release neurotransmitter there, stimulate a graded potential, which will then lead to an action potential carried through these neurons, and then the same deal for these neurons right here. So don't forget the fundamentals that we talked about in chapter 12 there. Okay, so now let's talk about the efferent side. So we talk about how we get the afferent information there, we get it to the somatosensory cortex here in the right hemisphere. So if someone's tickling the bottom of your left foot, you're probably going to want to jerk your left leg away. So to start with, for the efferent pathway, we are still on the right side of the brain. So we're going to want to get that information crossed back over to the left side of the body. So this time, these motor neurons carry their efferent information down through the white matter, and you'll notice we skip over the thalamus this time because it is not involved in most motor responses, at least those that are not a part of a motor circuit. So we skip over the thalamus this time. Let's follow the blue pathway here because this is the one that's going to decussate over to the contralateral side. Again, at the level of the medulla, that's usually going to be the case. If crossing over occurs, it will usually happen at the medulla, but not always. And then we go back down through a descending tract this time to the appropriate section of the spinal cord, and then we take a pathway out through the front part or the anterior part of the spinal cord. Take note of that. The efferent pathway goes out through the spinal cord and we synapse on a skeletal muscle. Those are going to be the muscles we want to contract to move our left leg away from the creepazoid that is tickling the bottom of our foot. Now, I said that probably somewhere between 80 to 90% of afferent and efferent pathways do cross over, but the purple pathway here, you will notice, does not cross over. So that is definitely not unheard of, and it's not impossible. Okay, so hopefully you can see here a lot of commonalities between information that is going to the brain, afferent, and information that is going away from the brain, efferent. All right, so let's round out this discussion by talking a little bit about the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is organized in terms of white matter and gray matter, pretty similar to what the cerebrum was. So it has kind of an outer cortex of gray matter, which is a little hard to see here, which is kind of unfortunate because this is literally just a black and white picture, and then an inner region that consists mostly of white matter. So the pons we mentioned is kind of like a bridge that connects the rest of the hindbrain with the cerebellum, connects the white matter of one to the white matter of the other. So what the cerebellum basically does, we're not going to get into huge amounts of detail, but it allows for further fine-tuning of motor commands that originate in the cerebral cortex, and it really allows us to kind of integrate that with sensory inputs from the environment. So other than what we talked about with the colliculi in terms of vision and hearing, we can also regulate our movements with the other things like the temperature around us, vibrations in the air, smells, tastes, and things of that nature. We can kind of regulate our movement based on more than just kind of commands that come strictly from the frontal lobe there. All right, so that is going to do it for this video. We have 2 more videos left. We are going to round out our discussion next time on the brain by discussing cranial nerves, and then our last discussion will be on the spinal cord. So I hope you will join us for that. See you next time.